A new pastor was visiting the homes of his congregation, and he came to one house and he saw lights on, so he made an assumption that someone was there, and he knocked on the door. Nobody answered, and yet he could hear noises inside the room. And so he knocked again. And when there was still no response, he reached into his pocket and took out his business card and wrote a little note on the back of it that said Revelations 3:20, and he stuck it in the door. And he never heard from whoever the person was in the house. However, the next Sunday, they were counting the offering, and he looked down into the plate, and there was his business card. And he grabbed it and turned it over and looked at it. And sure enough, the person had written a simple message below his that stated Genesis 3:10. Well, the pastor grabbed his Bible really quick and opened it up to see what the verse had to say, and he started to laugh. Revelations 3:20 began, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." And Genesis 3:10 reads, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked." We know from Genesis that men and women were created naked, and they knew no shame. Then along came that nasty old serpent and said, "Oh, go ahead and eat it. It's okay. It's not forbidden fruit. Just take it and eat." And then what happened? Their eyes were opened and they realized they were naked. And then when they heard God coming, Adam and Eve went further into the garden because they were ashamed. My guess is there isn't a one of us that has not experienced shame in some shape or form during our life. As children, we probably heard from a parent or an adult, "Shame, shame on you." Or maybe we heard the word shame, shame. And then there was also, "You should be ashamed of yourself." I spent my high school years in Portland, Maine, and every year in our English classes, we were required to memorize 100 lines of poetry. I can still recite portions of Hamlet's soliloquy. "To be or not to be, that is the question." Now, if you're anything like me, however, I do not memorize well. That's why foreign languages have been so difficult for me. Now, in my sophomore year, I saw somebody in one of my classes take very tiny pieces of paper with cheat notes on them and put them in the cuff of their sweater. I thought that was a pretty good idea. And so when I was required to learn my first poem that year, that's what I did. I got as far down as I could, however many lines it was, and memorized it, and then proceeded to put the rest of it in my sweater sleeve. Well, Miss Jensen caught me. I was so humiliated for cheating. I felt so ashamed in front of my classmates. It was then that I decided that I was going to resign from my position as president of the Greater Portland Christian Youth Council. After all, I didn't deserve that position because I had set a terrible example. Fortunately for me, one of my classmates that was in my youth group at church told Miss Jensen what my intentions were. And she cornered me after class one day and told me not to resign, that she knew I would never do this again. And she did, however, give me an F on the assignment, and I still had to memorize that damn poem. I can't remember what it was to this day. What are some of the things that you've been ashamed of? What has struck in your life in childhood or in adulthood? Anybody want just a word or two? Not doing it perfectly. That's a good one. Not doing enough. Or I'm not good enough. What's another one? Put down by other people in public. And you can almost feel the redness in your face beginning to show. Any other ones? Well, in Dr. Brown's research from Daring Greatly, she lists, of all things, 12 categories that that shame comes from. She said it's appearance and body image, money and work, motherhood and fatherhood, family, parenting, mental and physical health, addiction, sex, aging, religion, surviving trauma, and being stereotyped or labeled. That's a pretty huge list. That's a lot of categories. And shame is real pain for people. Just imagine the famous people who have had to experience shame publicly, like Monica Lewinsky, who had an affair with our president. And that dragged on for months in the media. And she still suffers from it to this day, and yet she's what, in her 40s or 50s? They stayed in the news, it's like forever. Or how about Lance Armstrong, who got caught drugging himself to win races? He was stripped of all of his medals, and including one from the Olympics. Or Emma Stone, who's won 2 Academy Awards as Best Actress because she was too thin, she was too skinny, and they dubbed her in the media. In her book, Daring Greatly, Brene Brown explains we all have shame. We all have good and bad and dark and light inside of us. But if we don't come to terms with our shame and struggles, we start believing that that's where something's wrong with us, that we're bad, flawed, not good enough. Even worse, we start acting on those beliefs. If we want to be fully engaged, to be connected, we have to be vulnerable. In order to be vulnerable, we need to create or develop resistance to shame. Carl Jung says shame is a soul-eating emotion. That creates quite a picture in my mind. John Milton stated that where shame is, there's also fear. That's why we worked today with a little bit of fear in the meditation. Jung says that shame is the swampland. Jungians, rather, say that shame is the swampland of the soul. We are all in the swampland of shame when we hide from our vulnerabilities. And yet vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. Vulnerability is the most accurate measure of courage. And what is our theme this year? That's right. Vulnerability is about a willingness to take risks, and that is courage. When we're in that place of shame, we fear vulnerability and risk-taking and change. Or rather, when we're in the place of shame, not change. After all, we don't want to look stupid. We don't want to look crazy. We don't want to look like we're out of line and doing something that we shouldn't do. How many of you have a creative idea bumping around in your head right now? Yeah, a lot of you. Maybe it's a painting you want to make or a book you'd like to write. It could be learning a new skill like photography or a language or pottery, but you've never made the time to let it happen. Is it fear from looking stupid, or that you don't think that you're capable of learning something new? Or is it that old thought, I'm not good enough, that's still gnawing away at your brain? That is all about shame. Public speaking used to be the #1 fear in America. Why? because people were fearful of being vulnerable in front of others or looking stupid in front of others. If either of those happened, shame and embarrassment would surely show up in the individual. Shame is like the gremlin within that says, I'm not good enough. Shame is stating, I'm not pretty or handsome enough. I'm not thin enough. I'm not big enough. I'm not smart enough. Or I'm not talented enough. Shame is not guilt because guilt focuses on our behavior. While shame says, I'm bad, behavior says, I did something bad. That's a huge difference. Dr. Brown shares that shame has a direct correlation with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, and eating disorders. That's a heck of a list. Author Pete Sheehan, who works with large companies like IBM and Apple, states, the secret killer of innovation is shame. You can't measure it, but it's there. Every time someone holds back on a new idea or failure to give feedback to their manager and is afraid to speak up in front of a client, you can be sure that shame played a part. That deep fear we all have of being wrong, of being belittled or feeling less than, is what stops us taking the very risk that requires our move for companies to move forward. Shame becomes fear, and fear leads to risk aversion, and risk aversion kills innovation. Shame also prevents connections with others and inner growth. And why are these so extremely important? Our inner growth comes from our willingness to look at ourselves and reach out to others. It's also about our willingness to initiate our own spiritual growth. I've shared a lot about what shame does to us and where it comes from, but there's another example of where it starts. In an article in therapist.com by Susan Radlowski, who is an MSW, she explains the 5 major causes. Social norms. Communities, families, and cultures have norms and expectations regarding gender and race and ability and economic status and sexuality. We may feel shame if we don't achieve these expectations, even if they're unhealthy or impossible to achieve. Religion. Faith communities might shame people if their actions or circumstances or identities don't conform to the community's beliefs. Some religions shun or excommunicate their members for divorcing another, for separating from another, or for being from the LGBTQ community. Thank God we don't do those things. Trauma and abuse. Shame is common and painful. After effects of abuse and sexual assaults and other major traumas in our life. The shame that survivors can experience may continue for years, impacting their relationships and their mental health. Just imagine someone who survived the campfire, and yet because they're the head of the family, they feel that they can't express their feelings. They have to stuff them down because it might show a weakness. Just imagine stuffing your feelings all the time. Comparison. Circumstances remind us of perceived shortcomings can stir up shame. Let's say you're struggling with financial issues in your life and your very best friend takes exorbitant trips around the world or buys a fancy toy for themselves. And you feel shame that you can't do the same. And finally, the 5th is the internal factors. Some people are more prone to shame than others, and shame tends to affect people more intensely in certain life stages. such as adolescence or aging. If someone has mental health disorders, they also are more likely to feel shame, whether due to their altered state of mind or from the stigma associated with mental health. Even as adults, we've had authority figures in our lives. As children, we certainly had several. There were our parents and our teachers and other relatives and babysitters, just to name a few. As adults, we've had bosses or co-workers and spouses or even friends that may have shamed us. The shame can come from outside sources or internal beliefs and a combination of both. There is the influence of shame, which is an attempt to make other people change their behavior. Shame teaches people to believe that they're inherently bad, making it difficult to envision something better or healthier choices. Just imagine how that would affect our own personal spiritual growth. Shame should never be used as a motivator. One study that was cited indicated that people with addiction were more likely to relapse and return to that addiction if they were shamed for their behavior. Shame is also used to control others. Someone can be shamed into conforming to a social norm for fear that they're excluded. Just think about our teenage gangs. They're forced to join to survive and then forced into certain norms. This can happen in workplaces, faith communities, neighborhoods, schools, families, and friend groups. It's an emotion that enables stigma. And stigma establishes certain parts of people's lives or identities as disgraceful and socially unacceptable. Its purpose is to set rules for what is allowed within society and what isn't. And in society today, mental illness, suicide, and homelessness all carry a certain stigma. In Daring Greatly, Brené Brown describes the 4 steps to develop shame resistance that we all can do. First, she says it's important to think about the elements that cause us to feel shame. Exactly how do those exist within your life? Why do they exist, and who do they harm or benefit when you have them? What is the broader impact in your life? We have to be willing to reach out and develop also compassionate, loving relationships. This is why vulnerability is so important. We need relationships with people who are empathetic and willing to listen. Finally, it's important to share your stories and others to share them with you. Through our sharing of stories, we have a greater understanding of ourselves and others and know that we're not in the boat alone. Shame derives its power when we don't speak about it. We're caught between a rock and a hard place. Fear being vulnerable, and so the darkness and the challenges and the fears stay hidden. We spend so much time and energy trying to avoid our challenges in life and hard topics, and yet when we face them, we become freer. Brené calls the following quote that she uses her twinkle-like quote. Only when we're brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. The infinite power of our light. Only when we're willing to peel away the layers of the onion and we will find the heart of an issue so we can heal it. I always tell my spiritual mentor, we're not putting a Band-Aid on this one. Let's get it healed. And that may take time to find all the layers and what the issue is. When I work with my spiritual mentor, I'm always surprised when something shows up that I dealt with 2 years ago. And when I complain that I dealt with that, why is it showing back up? Catherine always reminds me that my consciousness has shifted. I'm going deeper. And that's what happens with when we find what is hidden in the darkness and we put light on it. We begin to heal and we're freer. Dr. Brown's research suggests that building relationships based on vulnerability and empathy can help us overcome negative impact of shame. Having a strong support system allows us to help others cope with their own feelings of shame. Social acceptance and connection is reinforced by our brain chemistry, and the pain that results from social rejection, and disconnection is the real pain. It is so important in our spiritual community to reach out to others, especially to newcomers, especially the people that you don't know. Make it your intention to meet somebody new every time you walk through that door. Connecting with others is one of the things that helps prevent suicides. We have all experienced times in our life when we're in that place of fight or flight or freeze. Brown cites the work of Linda Hartling and Karen Horney to outline the strategies of disconnect we use to deal with the shame. Some of us move away by withdrawing and hiding from others and silencing ourselves and keeping the secrets of the shame. That's known as flight. Others move towards seeking to appease and please other people. And still others move against trying to gain power over others through their own aggression and their own fighting shame with shaming someone else. That's fight. Certainly these steps are similar to our fight, flight, or freeze when we're in fear. Ernest Holmes didn't write anything about shame or courage. He did, however, write a great deal on the topic of fear. In one of my favorite books, This Thing Called You, he stated the following: whatever you identify yourself with, you will become like. Whatever you resist until you make it a reality, you will also become like. Don't fight your fears. See through them. There is nothing in God's world to be afraid of. It is time for all of us to dig deep and take a look at our fears of shame and vulnerability. We certainly don't want to identify with our fears of shame, and we will surely find our life more open, more loving, and creative when we heal the darkness of shame within by putting light on it. Brene often quotes a speech that was presented by Theodore Roosevelt at the Sorbonne in Paris on April 23, 1910. She even said that she posted up on a board in her office, and that every day when she was writing the book, that she would take it down and she would read it to herself. And note that the book that we've focused on the last 2 months is directly from this quote by Theodore Roosevelt. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again and again. Because there is no effort without error and shortcomings, but who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasm the great devotions, who spends himself into a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the high of achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. This is the truth in my life, and this is the truth in yours. And so it is. Amen. Jaylyn?